Last week, we did a deep dive with Chandler, and he's been spending about 15 years since he retired from National Institutes of Health in biochemistry. He was one of the top biochemists, and he's always wondered why physics and mathematics falls apart when you start working in chemistry. And so he's been looking at the symbolic systems as you go away from physics and the paradigm metaphor, as Jaime talks about, to a different system. And it was fascinating, at least to me, because he's talking about issues of identity in atoms and molecules, how the art of assembly is done at the atomic level. And he goes, so it's identity, how information is processed in chemicals in terms of channeling of ideas, in a sense of architectures that allow things to go in only certain directions. What this does is really allow us to question the foundations of cybernetics. The questions of cybernetics has been based upon research in neurophysiology, looking at the apex of evolution in terms of neurological systems, where we then are able to take our information technologies, Shannon's information theory, etc., and actually provide a technology base. But that's based upon Boolean algebra, Boolean structures where you need to know the universe, and then you can then modulate, inform, navigate within that universe. So if you took an example of a telephone system and I was going to call up Department of Defense, the electronic operator would ask, what's the first letters of his last name? And it would take the universe of all the directories of DOD and the Pentagon and take, every time I entered a letter, it would shrink the universe till I got to Jason Hugh, you know. That is wonderful when we know the parameters of the system. The problem is, you know, when you're dealing with systems where we don't know our boundaries, i.e. natural systems, or the systems that we create around us in terms of constitutions, institutions, etc., we don't know what we're designing within. So the logic of physics and Boolean and the technologies is insufficient to deal with living systems. So the takeaway from the last week's presentation was our inability to found cybernetics upon anything except for neurological systems, which is powerful. It's very powerful, but it is not useful in social living organisms as useful. Therefore, you know, what is the new foundations, the new unfinished revolution, if you will, of cybernetics? We have to go back and look for those new foundations. That's the deep dive. The short-term prospect that we're looking at today is, what is it that, you know, we can actually say from the breadcrumbs left by our founders to where we need to go in the future. So I'm seeing today is really kind of like a Shark Tank, or in Japan, they call it the Dragon's Den, whereby, you know, if we had a group of investors with us today, what could we say the value-added proposition for them to fund a think tank, for them to fund specific projects, for them to work with us over a sustained period to make a difference? So I really see this, and I'll just conclude with this, us as a small group of concerned citizens, a la the Margaret Mead saying about small group of concerned citizens providing the ability to change the world. What is it that our small group could provide to this group of quasi-investors? Because I see us writing a white paper, a proposal to people to actually do that. So, you know, this has a very practical outcome It has to do a deep dive in terms of some theories, tools, and tactics. But what is it that we need to do to go move forward? So Loet, we were just talking about today's agenda being kind of a Shark Tank, or in Japan they call it the Dragon's Den, of what's the value added proposition of cybernetics? And the value added proposition that we've discussed over the past 2 weeks has been, you know, we have a asymmetric relation between the two children of cybernetics. The one child was the Norbert Wiener robotics, servo mechanisms, drones, capabilities to instantiate a information technology of circuitry, feedback loops, delayed systems in a circuitry that has been extremely powerful, but is now being used by tools of the state for surveillance, tools of oppression. How do we get the symmetry back that allows the social systems to then respond to the asymmetric? Because in asymmetric systems, they are positive feedback loops that continually grow and grow like a cancer. They don't have a limitations function. They don't have a governor, if you will, you know, like a steam engine governor that stops the fuel input so it slows down so it doesn't explode. That's what we really need. And let me just kind of summarize it in this way. There's a unique term of the English. The unique term is called a jack. Now, a jack is a boy who used to take off your boots, but now you have a boot jack, a little machine, a little thing that you put your boots on and it helps take it off. So it's, we have all these jacks that substitute for human activities in our machinery of the world or information technology. What do we need to do to influence and empower our own aspects of the world versus relying upon these jacks? And it's interesting when they talk about the Union Jack being the English symbol. It's the Union having to be propped up is literally what it means. But anyway.
Get your question, really. You were asking a question. What is it that we have to do to prop up?
Loet, your voice is too small.
I'm sorry.
You need to...
Didn't put the microphone correctly. Is it better?
Yeah,
so?
that's better. That's much better.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I didn't really get your question. Can you?
Yeah, the question is, what's the value added proposition of a new cybernetics that someone could invest in? We've gone through first order cybernetics, feedback loops, the technology. Heinz von Forster, others talk about second order, going through the observer, because every description is done by an observer. Now, where do we need to take that so we don't come locked in some academic do loop to actually impact? Or Jaime, you want to say it differently?
No, I want to amplify something you said earlier. Lowell said Boolean logic. There is kind of an emerging understanding that we have a lot of thinking that is kind of grounded or reduced into Boolean logic, and to find an alternative to that. Was that what you said, Lowell? Yeah. So what is an alternative to Boolean logic? Like, shall we do a modified Boolean logic and then another modification? Or is there like maybe something that needs to come before it? And then Loet, I would then argue communication philosophy, but that is for the group.
Because Boolean logic is a method, it's not a substance.
Well, it is being used as a substance by a lot of people, and that's what the problem is, I believe. Yeah.
But Loet's point is what we're looking for is the new method, just like the novum orgum of Francis Bacon is the new method. And what's the new methods that when you look at, in order to do a logic, you need parameters. And so what are the new parameters of living systems besides the mathematics of a directory of Department of Defense, and I can find out Jason Hughes' name by inputting the first letters of his last name and first name, etc. So
let's go back to your first question, because you add up so many questions at the same time. Your first question was, if we want to go from Hans von Förster with the observer as the central point to a next stage. And in my opinion, it is important to go from observations to expectations, because that alienates us also from the normal sciences, which operate in terms of expectations and test their expectations against observations. While Hans von Förster put first observations and then skips the expectations.
That's a wonderful insight, Luke.
Let me say something.
Yes.
When I first saw your topic abstract, Lowell, because I'm still in this moving processes, my brain is not completely coming back. But I had an instinct reaction. Number one, I would be fully agree with you and fully support. But I think we need to make a distinction at the very, very beginning of what exactly our cyberneticians has done in this previous 60, 70 years. You mentioned the engineering work and the radar and the feedback mechanism, etc., and that leads into neurophysiological work. And the neurophysiology, so for me, I think Loet is correct. We started actually from cognition. Actually, what the first order and the second order cybernetics provided us so far is a completely new understanding of cognition. Okay, now I see if it is a building, there's two exits. And I wish that we go to the right exit. The first exit is, I think, is, well, Edmondo, please do not be stupid. The first exit is to pay more and more attention to philosophy. Then from that exit, what can we get? We go back to the forever debate about the mind and the body. And Jaime will add, Popper here says, okay, we had a word 3. But still some argument is still there, even Stuart is not here today. But he is so focused on the the distinction between Aristotle thinking and the Platonic thinking. I think that is not a good exit for us to the next step. Because if you go back there, you go back to history, you go back to repeating all kinds of argument. And who can beat Kant? I mean, Kant is there, and a lot of great philosophers, they had addressed the issue from an early point, and so profoundly that we should just make use of them if we cannot push forward, like a Popper. Popper really pushed forward, and I think, from the mind-body problem. Now, the right exit, I would like to say, is that the application exit. So we go there, do something. So I have been promoting to replace the phrase, what's the point? What's your point? With, what's your action? So what's the action? So I have been asking Stuart this question for many years, and ASC people just do not, what looks like engage with the action. So So from Loet's point, the next thing is to study expectation. I completely, fully agree. And because going through there, we extended the territory about cognition into what? Into communication is the first thing. If you remember, I put 5C there. After communication, we have consensus building. And after consensus building, we have coordination. And after coordination, we have co-construction. We build our civilization again. So from that perspective, I think we really need to start working towards this new exit, which I think is my answer to Lowell's question. But asking myself, what's the action? You know, I tell you a story. In 2015 or something like that, I made a proposal to ISSS. I said, let's organize a team to build up a curriculum for K-12 students. I mean, for teachers like Chang here, so that the good ideas can be sent into our K-12 schools and colleges, and of course, graduate schools. So, well, some colleagues told me, oh, you just go ahead and write your own textbook. And I know it won't work because there are many professors writing their own book. It's an individual effort to put up just a new book. But I think that ideally, if we have an organizational or institutional backup, like ISSS or like ASC, or even Stuart did that academy later. So if this kind of multinational organization, credible and trusted by the public, can produce a curriculum, then we can put the curriculum, we can send the curriculum to all the schools. So that will be my action time. And that project used to have colleagues participating from 35 countries. But unfortunately, at that time, the ISSS leadership, they denied this. They refused to they refused to endorse this project. Just telling me, okay, Jason, go ahead to do your own textbook. Then I don't think that will be a solution. So and now ISSS is exchanging leadership. I think some new people is coming. And I think Paul Pongaro is going to become a president of ASC next year. So there is a hope, I see, if our small group here reinitialize this curriculum development effort, not as an individual effort, but as a group effort, and well, Club of Remy effort. And we can work with existing schools. And I did identify a very good organization. They have been teaching system dynamics to high school kids. And this is called the Waters Foundation. And they're based in Tucson, Arizona. I once contacted them, I said, okay, can we work together, blah, blah, blah. And, but I was
not so easy to work with other people together. I come to cybernetics from the angle of communication and control. I'm interested in communication and control. And that brings me to cybernetics, because it's traditionally the object of cybernetics, communication and control. But cybernetics is occupied by people who have specific ideologies, like the observation as primary.
I like that.
Yeah. So it's the field is stuck. It doesn't have a research agenda. It doesn't move. And so communication and control is, I'm working also in science studies, and there is more things happening. People are really looking at I worked the whole morning about a disruption indicator. That's cybernetics in my perspective, but it's more applied. It's more
it has to
empirical.
be applied. What I like about what Jason mentions is that we're looking at a curriculum. And I see that having started a school 20 years ago that now has 54 acres and students actually going in person now, that, you know, the deficiency in education is the deficiency of not understanding systems. They know facts, they know the treadmill to colleges. So I think that that is one project that's on the table as a curriculum. What Loet's talking about is much more of the applied epistemology, applied communication and regulation, I would say, instead of control, that allows us to look at specific projects. Last week, Peter Lewis talked about blockchain as an example. And the question on blockchain was, can it self-govern? And so, I mean, it's a very powerful technology. It has a truth function of at least fidelity of transactions to cut down on turbulence between interactions. But, you know, can cybernetics add anything to that sort of concrete project that Peter Lewis, of course, and Jaime, who is his person he brought together with us, are interested in?
Jaime.
Yeah, my first reaction is cybernetics will help them prevent from going down the rabbit hole, but that is something that can be discussed. What I heard is Jason is talking about something that's really for the whole association to pursue, and that would be wonderful because that is really long-term thinking. But something that our group could do is we need to have some paper now in which it's being articulated what it is that we're all agreeing on. Because I'm at the stage as a newcomer, I can say that I'm now hearing repetition of arguments. And of course, each repetition makes the argument better and stronger. But I think there's now really a benefit to write it down. And then I was thinking this whole week about, and I don't know whether I can share a screen, but this table here from
Yeah, you can share screen.
Yeah, Stuart Umpleby had sent this out, and he said, oh, that is something we did like 5 years ago. Michael Lissack tells what he thinks, Carl Muller, and then Stuart himself. And then I thought, why don't we all also add what we think about it, and what we think our view is, how this whole thing should further develop. And then once it's written down, it will become easier to start negotiating what it is that we're doing. Because I also think we may have a challenge of that we are using slightly different terminology, and to which extent are we actually saying the same? And I think we're saying the same. Or are we saying something different? Like the only way to find out, I guess, is to write it down, and then we can start fine-tuning. And so I don't know how many people got this document. It's an Excel sheet on Google Drive now, so it can be shared. So people can take a look at it and then see whether this is useful to move the conversation forward.
I think it's useful because if you look at the methodology that all three are saying is there is no methodology. And that's Loet's point, that indeed, you know, we're talking about ideologies and things and not about a method, a tool, a way of cognition that checks our worst instincts.
So let's begin to make a table of content. What should be in what are these points? Because I think it is, personally, I think it is more important to have an argument in text than to just have messages like points, yeah, bullet points.
Well, Loet, I completely agree, but we first need to have the points that we can argue about, because
So-
we're just arguing, and are we arguing fruitfully or not? And so if
So
something
let's
is...
make a list of things which should be in.
Yeah, yes.
Like
And
a table of content.
yes. And now the reason...
Could you expand on that, Loet, your table of contents? I like that.
So, for example,
7 slides.
the history of cybernetics would be
Right.
a problem.
Okay.
And then you get first order cybernetics. How is it different from second order cybernetics?
Yep.
What has been added? Then you get what comes after second order cybernetics. Is that
Yep.
third order cybernetics, or is that something more concrete? What is it? Yeah, and so you end with the applications.
All right.
I love that.
If I
And
may...
then you can write chapters, or you can do drafts of chapters, and maybe it ends up to a little booklet or something like that.
Yeah.
Lou, let me mention, Stuart had a little slideshow titled "The History of Cybernetics." Exactly the title Lowell is typing here. And I translated that into Chinese even, so that's in multiple language now. I would dig that out and forward to you guys. So maybe that could become a template that we start adding things or deleting things.
Yeah,
All right.
fantastic.
Also,
If I may interrupt now, there is a reason I picked this. It is because 3 people got together and wrote this. So this is a wheel. It may be a square wheel, but it didn't come by itself. I mean, they worked together to put this out. And so that's the reason I thought that if we start from this thing, and you're right,
okay,
it would be a
I
table of
agree.
content, but I would suggest to start from the work that has been done and then modified and add questions, and I give it back to them and say, look, we're doing this, and maybe you could answer a few extra questions that make it all easier to understand. So so that was the only reason I proposed it, because it's already, there is already a way of thinking about it, and also it may make it easier for us. Personally, my major problem is time management. I have like way too many things going on, and so I'm looking for things that are easy and well, nothing is easy, of course, but relatively quick to share
So
ideas.
let's take it seriously. And
Yeah.
the first point, data for second order science studies. And then Lissac answers beliefs and feelings when there is a significant conflict. How is he going to do that?
Well, I would add what seems to me a very important point here. That is the connection between complexity and cognition. The notion of complexity is from the beginning at the heart of the cybernetic enterprise. And this notion of complexity also can lead us to the analysis of how cybernetic introduces to multifactorial methodology. And it is also a point that is very important to establish the connection between cybernetics and theory of systems.
Very good, very good. I think that's even better than doing first the history.
Yeah.
Because we shouldn't focus too much on the history.
Yeah.
It should be to the point.
Yeah.
What
And the
Edmondo was saying there is talking about the cognitive divide between normal thinking and complexity.
Yes.
And that's exactly where Bateson, von Forster, and others said, we don't have ways of thinking beyond our common sense, in a sense. And if you
And then
read,
Maturana made the self-organization.
yes, right,
Which is a very, very good one.
which is one of the pillars, but it can't be the only pillar. One pillar wobbles.
And,
So,
and I think we need to pay attention to what I distinguish as a vertical cognition versus horizontal communication. By horizontal, I meant the cross sigma area of the bell curve 2.0. So bell curve 2.0 is related with what Edmondo mentioned, the complexity. Different people functioning in different complexity level well determined by their current brain or their learning speed or whatever, but in each given time, they had a certain limitation of a complexity perceptibility. So when we try to communicate among different complexity groups, then we always have a need to reinterpret or rephrase what point we are trying to make, and eventually we want to target at a final action point instead of what's the point. For example, the current political argument here all pointing to vote, go vote, and the vote is an action word. So what all the previous merits cybernetics bring us can really provide to a large range of people, not just 76, but 76,000 at least, or 76 million. It is the challenge we need to really discuss at least. I think Larry, you have been writing a book, a textbook, right? Similar to our intention.
No, it's not a textbook. I've sort of given up on the idea of the value of a textbook. It's a book for lay public, that tries to answer certain questions about the value of cybernetics. I guess what I'd like to add at this point is I'm sensing that my idea of cybernetics and its value is different than others. Not all others, but certainly some others and those here. For example, I now look at cybernetics as having more to do or to say about conversation and autonomy rather than communication and control. These are ideas that actually in distinct domains, and I need both. I need the idea of control and communication in order to be able to look at its counter, conversation and autonomy. And in terms of the counter to power in the social domain, conversation can serve that purpose. Conversation is the converse of control. Another area is that there seems to be some difference is the mixing of what you might call phenomenal domains or logical types. I don't see, for example, our study of living systems as being something you can just move into the social domain. And yet it seems to be that push, and it comes within certain cybernetic circles. These are different domains. And I think the dilemma for us is that as humans, we're both biological systems and not biological systems simultaneously. And this dialectic is something that I think we need to take seriously. One other thing in terms of application, in terms of science, my second order science would put the primary unit of analysis as a conversation, and then look and see what when you create a network of conversations, what the consequences are. I'll stop there.
If I could just add to what Larry has said, I've spent 8 years trying to figure out what the American Revolution, how they designed their experiment with their natural philosophy and science, with their Scottish Enlightenment versus Continental Enlightenment ideas. And it really goes along what Larry was saying. I mean, they were much more advanced, I think, in cybernetic thinking of how do you design the super system over the paradigm, over the common sense, everyday logic. And the focus, of course, was how do you create the infrastructure around that allows conversation and differences to work itself out. It's obviously not working very well right now. But the design, and when I did a couple of weeks ago, the incidence of the term problemique, which is not just a problem as a discrete entity you solve, but as the interrelationship of all the issues surrounding your living environment. That it was really started in 1708 and just ramped up in the Republic of Letters of the American Revolution, and then went down by the 1830s. And then in 1945, the same term came up and went, compounding. So that idea of looking at power that you're talking about, Larry, looking at logical types, but the importance is as you move from physics to chemistry to biochemistry to biology to ecologies to cognitive systems, cultural systems, you're really dealing with differences of symbolic systems and the viability pillars or the lethal variables you need to be aware of. That's worthy of some really serious thinking. And so I'll just stop right there.
I would like to react to you also, Larry, because you more or less opposed our positions as communication and control on my side, and on your side, autonomy and conversation. I'm also interested in your type of issues, and I look forward to a more elaborate framework and also on the ethical dimensions of cybernetics. I was just telling where I come from. It's not the case that I'm closed off from other approaches or I don't want to see it. In addition to autonomous, we also have autopoietic. And how does that differ? And then we have a bridge between that type of autonomy questions you are asking and the type of communication questions which I'm fascinated with. I want to make a second point, that your point about not mixing up domains, I fully agree. And part of my argument has all the time been that it is one of the most important things in the present period that we are moving from the domain of individuals to the domain of communication. At the super individual level, what's happening and how can we model those dynamics? Okay, I wanted to make those 2 points in response to your points.
And I would like a clarifying question. So I get that you say from individual to conversation, but I'm totally baffled when you say supra-individual. So what is the difference between supra-individual and a relational interaction within a conversation?
Is it a question to me?
Yes.
I think that in communication, that has to do with, particularly with modern communication, with modernity. There are codes developed. The easiest one is, and is close to his point, is the Montesquieu's coding of constitutional domains. But you have also other codes. You have codes also developed within science or in policy making. And these codes are not individual. They're attributes of the communication, not of people.
Yes, but then I think we need, okay, if I may respond, in management, they call that standard operation procedures or routines. In evolutionary economics, like something that is just part of the culture. However, in order to study it from a human perspective, we cannot talk in a godlike perspective, like something that's hovering above us, or that we're just totally incapable of getting because we're just the victims or the subjects. So what the code is, in my understanding, is something that has been written down somewhere, and we can always find somewhere a text where there was a discussion about this is what is going to be and this is why it is. And so ultimately, okay, that is just my view of
I'm not saying that we should godlike stay above the codes. I'm only saying that given that we have a system which is evolving in terms of codes, which are beyond individual control, we can no longer have that godlike position, and we also should not return to the individual as we have done, but we should see how it is only in discourses that solutions are being developed.
If I could use Stuart Brand's statement, if we're going to be acting as gods, we had better start thinking like gods. Let me just share a screen. You know, if you're looking at what is it that we were talking about over the past 2 weeks, you have in the middle observation and measurement, like science as we have now. And then you have the paradigm of science, and Thomas Kuhn and others talked about the structure of scientific revolution, but that was all within the logic of Western civilization and forgot about natural philosophy and science that informed the American Revolution. So you're looking at levels of, you know, in a sense, the logic is the species level or the evolutionary level, and the world we see is in the middle, the observation and measure.
Well, I have the question for you to clarify. Are you believing that beside this logic square, there are other logics as well?
Absolutely. If you look at
the we have Chinese logic, which is a target for criticism.
Right. You know, I'm a cultural anthropologist that deals with cognitive systems. So, you know, the logic that I've seen in dealing with the Japanese and American businesses, I had to understand the differences of a Japanese approach to perception and observation versus an American. But it goes deeper than that, I think, in terms of what I think Loet is talking about, which is the evolutionary, because evolution never occurs on the individual level. It only occurs on the species or the logic of that mollusk or whatever the structure is we're trying to evolve.
This is a very important topic that we need to do another session, Lowell. Because, you know, I have been working on the concept of mainstream civilization versus peripheral cultures. And I would intend to say that the mainstream civilization uses this universal logic as logic, and some less developed culture, they had their, I mean, I won't say wrong logic, but I would say I cannot find the right English word. Fault. I mean, logic with mistakes. I will send you a list of what we call Chinese logic as the target of criticism, as an example, and the purpose of developing that civilization development index framework is to identify that the shared universal logic value of this planet versus those not shared and even not shareable. Let's keep in mind that we may need to do another session focusing on that.
Right. If I could just return to what Loet was mentioning about our table of contents, because I think that's very powerful of our next step.
Yes.
And then Edmondo said, you know, what we really are dealing with is complexity and cognition. But what we need to say, what are we moving towards? And the question that of what are we moving towards needs to go back to the founding of cybernetics, which is about governing, steering, navigation. How do we get those tools to look, as Loet was mentioning, not just something that's static in our academic exercises, but are dealing with how do we map the future, how do we map the past? And the real influence of cybernetics is we just can't map the future from our rational space of what we see in our minds. It's about perception, observation, all those areas that are outside the way we normally think.
I would add, if you take it that way, that one of the most important lessons which we have learned is that complex systems cannot be instructed.
Right. They can't be controlled.
They can be controlled. Yeah.
So I created a table of content on this Excel sheet. And actually, there is really a logic to what Stuart was doing. And I recognize that from management from any problem solving activity, because they kind of started with saying, what's the purpose? So what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And then they go to, I mean, they have an order there, but the order can be changed. And then the appendices is where then I would say the descriptive stuff goes. What has it been historically? And that is then being used to answer the 5 questions.
Jaime, if we are going to focus on the term second order science, perhaps we also need to do a discussion over the science point version 1, version 2, through version 4 that I suggested. I mean, is that a good frame? Is that a good frame to replace this one? And also, someone asked before, is there a third order? I think the Russian group did have a solid description, a perception of the third order, and perhaps who knows beyond. I just invited a cybernetician professor from Romania, and I think he missed the time zone thing. So he was trying to connect with us, but he's not here yet. But I think the Russian group and the East European group they had a different perspective about this issue that we do need to discuss together.
So if I could just start with the problem state, the starting point is in second order cybernetics. I think the starting point is what Jason was mentioning, which is we have a paradigm of Science 1 now. Science 1 has informed the use of our cybernetic insights of systems and circuitry. The question is, do we need another type of science with a rigor, a methodology? Maybe that's the beginning question for us. And then we go into second order as a subsidiary driver.
And that beginning question follows an immediate question that if we need a different criteria, as Stuart proposed, then we need a new proper. I mean, we need a new Karl Popper to distinguish science versus pseudoscience. And here, if we abandon the criteria for science 1.0, then we do need a new criteria to distinguish the correct solid science 2.0 versus pseudoscience 2.0. And so I think the organization development folks and facilitators, coaches, they have a huge association and a lot of practitioners going on there. And there are good stuff and the bad stuff also need to be distinguished.
Should we do 0.0? Why should we do 0.0? Why not science 1.43 or something like that?
Yeah,
is it decimal?
Yeah, I had a slide.
Then we can also take the old science on board.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you look at the Karl Popper enterprise, he was trying to get a truth function within existing analytic science. What we are proposing is a different form of a truth function, which we've discussed in the past 2 weeks, which is a descriptive observational. And I go back to Franz Boas, who came to America from Germany and started American anthropology. He wrote an article called The Study of Geography, which is a very strange title, in 1887, where he was complaining about the analytic science that was coming about and eclipsing, saying this idea of grounding knowledge in the place of where the people are, the anthropology, the cosmographic world, how it all interrelates as a system. He says, we need two sciences. We don't need one. And it's almost imperialism of the science one he was talking about, which was the French Comte and logical positives, that's eclipsing this other more broad science. So I think if we form it in a form of a new science, a different way of looking at science that is broader, but as complementary, we can't sit there and just say the fact that we're talking on machines that science has helped produce is ridiculous. We're not Luddites, but we are something that's broader, but it has to have a rigor.
Very nice.
So what will be the title for next session?
Edmondo?
Yes, I would ask Larry if he's using the notion of conversation according to Gordon Pask's use of the term conversation. Because if so, Gordon Pask used conversation in order to explain a cognitive system developing between people. But I don't know if this is the use of Larry.
Yeah, I second that, Larry. You put perhaps a distinction between what you use term communication versus conversation would be very helpful here, because I think people use them interchangeably. At least I use them interchangeably. So,
yeah, just a quick comment on Gordon Pask. Was he that talked about conversations being the converse of control, as being not about communication. Communication might be a byproduct, but it's not about communication. It's about creating and maintaining distinctions. Mm-hmm. My use of the word, which I think I worked out with him, is that it's an interaction. Excuse me, the dynamics of interaction between two or more organizationally closed entities in a language such that the dynamics moves from an asynchronicity, which could be a conflict or a disagreement, or but an asynchronicity toward a synchronicity.
So that's a deeper and a more rich perception than communication, which is more technical oriented.
No, it's a counter, in a way.
Okay.
It's when I say, Jason, put your mic on mute, that's an attempt at communication. There's no, I'm not inviting a conversation. You might not understand what I'm saying, in which case then we might have a back and forth about it, but that's communication. A conversation is when we have some friction, some disagreement, some tension, and we're trying to together work it out. And our preference for recurrent interaction with another is what then motivates that continuation of that interaction.
Oh, Larry, when you say an organizationally closed entity, that means that he's willing to replace a human being by a machine? Or does he acknowledge that a human being is different from a machine and always forever will be different, and that there are no intelligent computers that will be identical to machines?
It doesn't preclude the possibility.
So he believes.
Yeah, but all I would say, and I don't want to speak for him, but I would say that the direction of technology, the technologies of computing and communication, have been against conversation. In other words, it's a desire to make things so that doesn't have to be a conversation. And but it doesn't mean you couldn't have a technology. Possibly, I can imagine one in which you could have an interaction which you would call a conversation. The reason for using the term organizationally closed entities is I can have a conversation with myself. I can take two positions or two perspectives, and then that generates thinking. That generates some thought. Conversation also, the idea of information, the original Shannon Weaver idea of information, isn't as relevant here because it's not about communication. But in a sense, what you are trying to do in a conversation is to create infinite information. You're trying to create something new. I don't say trying to, but that's one consequence of a conversation. It can create some entirely new idea that neither of the two participants or more had in mind when they started. And that's an idea that would be like infinite information.
So that's a kind of synergy.
Yes.
And I think
I have
that's
a
really
synergy.
one of
I've worked on a synergy measure.
And I think that's one of the real outcomes of this past 2 weeks has been, the difference between physics emphasis upon entropy and what Jerry Chandler mentioned is syntropy, how things come together, or as Larry was talking about, conversations as they start to move from asynchronous to synchronous world. But I just want to add one other dimension that I think most of what Paskian type thinking is limited in, because it's not about just interaction between individuals. It's the interaction of the ecology of conversations, what's allowed, the infrastructures for it, the public policy issues. So if you look at the way propaganda is used in Nazi Germany, versus the type of exploratory conversation of learning and the transformation into something new, you're dealing with a very different type of interaction and use of information. So it's levels that we need to be talking about.
What I want from cybernetics is I've identified three things that I want from cybernetics. One is I want an alternative to hierarchy as a way of thinking about how we handle complexity. Not that hierarchy can't be useful, but it's so dominant that people use it without even thinking that there is an alternative, or that they're actually, using this structure.
Normally, people would say hierarchy as the alternative for hierarchy.
That's an academic word, so I wouldn't get that at all.
It's just a question.
Since I live in the current world and it's dominated by hierarchy, the best I can do at this point is, I think, not the best, but one thing I can do is to treat all hierarchies as temporary, as the desirability of them being temporary. And then of always trying to create something, as an alternative. The second thing I want from cybernetics is an alternative to the idea of goal-oriented purpose. Where I use the word goal here in a sense of a target, of something, select a point in the future that I'm selecting and then trying to drive toward, or an alternative to that way of thinking. That way of thinking also was very dominant, not so much perhaps in the East, but certainly in the Western countries. It prevails. And then the third thing I want is an alternative to the idea of belief as the way of anchoring ourselves. And
would you be addressing your belief's third point about a different truth function of how do we ground truths apart from scientific facts, bits and
I like for scientists and myself when I do science to regard everything that they come up with as temporary. Any thing that they regard as truth to be temporary. It may be currently useful, fine, I accept it temporarily, I use it, and that's fine. But the idea of truth being temporary is not something that prevails in the scientific world. What I want as an alternative to belief is something like passion. Passions are desires that hold so strongly that it would take a lot to change them, but they're desires, not beliefs. So for me, for example, I would say that my passions include participation and dialogue. And that then it becomes the anchors that, move me forward.
I like your use of anchors. I think that's worthy of conversation in the future.
I interrupted you with the question of why not the alternative of hierarchy would be a heterarchy or a network-like structure, whether we haven't moved from hierarchically models to, let's say, the Herbert-Simon models on the one side towards more networked type of with eigenvectors and things like that.
Yeah, there are circular recursive structures. There are network structures. There also is a move, could be a move toward more focus on process rather than structure, and that begin looking at dialectical processes rather than rational processes or the traditional rational processes.
And the other point I still wanted to make in relation to your previous remark, that I mentioned that I have a synergy indicator, which perhaps there's a kind of application which can be related with your conversation idea that there is a growth towards, how do you call it, towards synchronicity.
So, Larry, have you consulted the psychoanalytic literature by any chance, or another way of saying that, the hierarchy, where does it exist? Is it in the head of the thinking human? Is it a symbol that reinforces it? Or is it out there in human nature, like exemplified every single day? How are you approaching that question? And have you considered working with psychoanalytic literature?
The different responses, but my response is it's embedded in the language that we use.
Yes. And the language resides also inside the head or does something to the head.
No, language is
No?
something we do together.
Yeah, but
Yeah, and different. You know,
okay.
we talk about it being in the culture. Just it is, but it's something we do together.
Is it something different for different languages? Or is it universal in all languages?
I've been, my interest here is in natural language rather than, the formal or.
Let me specify. I thought the question is.
There are differences for sure.
So is Latin, for example, hierarchy?
I'm finding alternatives in other languages.
So is Latin, for example, the traditional language which is hierarchical?
Say that again.
Latin, is that the hierarchy?
Netting?
In history, hierarchy, the Pope and things like that, were very much associated with the Roman Empire. And with Latin as the language to control that. And still there's an idea of that in the 18th century in France, that French is the natural language, the lingua franca. But that isn't your approach to language, Esther. I'm trying to understand what you.
I'm talking about what's embedded in the grammars, the syntax of our language.
Is there hierarchy in the grammar and the syntax?
Yes.
As an example, if you look at Western civilization, our monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all influenced by the same, and they share the same creation narrative. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was good. That separates Western civilization as an abstraction from the reality of the world around you, which has been our power and has also been the misery of the world that we're now in. So it goes back to, as an anthropologist, I look at creation narratives as a deep embedding in Larry's language in the system of language itself that's unique to the Western civilization. And this brings us to one of the points we probably want to bring up in this brochure pamphlet that we're talking about, which is, I think, one of the real powers of cybernetics is to develop a different type of public intellectual. Right now, the most corrupt industry are think tanks. And I've been in think tanks my whole life because they're ideologically bought with results, purposes, etc. But the idea of coming together to look at a new way of forming meaning, production of meaning, if you will. I mean, it's interesting in the letters of the founders of America, they talked not about the Marxian ownership of the means of production, but they talked about ownership of the means of production of meaning.
Oh yeah,
The idea of how do you produce meaning of the individuals as they come together in a union. And so it's production of meaning, not production of things, as a Marxian interpretation would be. And that goes along with what Larry was really trying to get at, is how do you create a system that allows conversations and interactions to bend towards unity versus disunity and distraction.
Do you happen to have an article where you describe this from the founding fathers doing that?
I didn't catch your question, Loet. I'm sorry.
Do you happen to have an article where you have reported on this or on the production of meaning?
the book I'm working on called Uncommon Sense, Making an American Experiment has a subsection of a chapter on that.
Is that easy to send it
and that's not
PDF?
published yet, but I've been working on it, and I can extract a little of that. I could, in one of our presentations, I could give a quick presentation on what the structure of the experiment was done, how it was done, and the influences and how it differed from the Continental Enlightenment, because we're all children of the Enlightenment in the West. It was so radical, the way they were thinking in their Republica letters as they exchanged it. And historians don't deal with that. They like the glittering objects of history. We need, history is too important to be left to historians in Hollywood.
Or just,
I could put something together, Loet, if you're interested.
Thanks.
I would add a dilemma, and that is how to speak from the language that we have about alternatives. We have what we have. We're talking here. It's the language that we inherited. How do we talk in a way such that alternatives to how we're talking,
We have to travel to an alien planet and stop everything from the beginning.
I think English is an alternative to French.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in that sense, it really has to do with your subject, because English had many more words than French, so it has less control.
But is the logic behind English and behind the German, behind the French, the same logic?
And then we're starting a war between the English and the French about which language is superior.
No, I'm not talking
It's been going on for hundreds of years.
Leibniz invented logic for that, and the characteristica universalis.
This is not a war. This is an analysis about the hidden structure that I think some linguistics would argue that for each different language that there is isomorphic pattern behind this thing. So that's why we have this thing called the grammar.
No, I was saying something different, because French has approximately, like most Western European languages, 40,000 words in general. English has 100,000. Some people say, because English has words, the same words from the Germanic tradition and from the Romanic tradition, like freedom and liberty. So there are two words, which creates more space.
More resolution.
No.
Loet, I mean, it's fascinating when you're talking about how the founding fathers use punctuation, and the concepts like liberty were always capitalized as different than just freedom being something free. So one of the interesting things that in the American Revolution that was almost erased by editors in the modern world was their writing of mind, meaning your mind, Loet, and my mind as a brain, and the mind of the people, which was always capitalized. So when Jefferson said, I put on the altar of God eternal vigilance against tyranny over the minds of men, that minds was capitalized. That means it had a difference between freedom and our individual mind and the larger system that was allowed. So it's interesting that the differences, as you mentioned, about how you go from words of liberty and freedom, because there's a constellation in there.
I like your example about the sentence, let's eat grandma. and
Right.
whether or not you have you have
So,
you have a
Edmondo,
comma. Let's
uh,
grant them up. The question is, are all the cultures using the same way to put that comma? I mean, is there a hidden structure that underline all different languages, or is it not?
No, it isn't.
I think you could say that every language has punctuation. How it is punctuated. So if you look at how in the films of Bateson and Mead of the mother and child interacting, she is teaching through body language and inclination, inflection, a way of seeing and thinking. That's different than when the American mother is coming home from the hospital giving birth, and in that ride, she's teaching that child how to become an American. It's setting up contexts for it to then explore and then put words to and a grammar to and a syntax towards.
well,
Someone should take the lead if you want to pursue this.
I would like to do.
pursuing what?
I had
Table of contents.
understood that people wanted to make something together, or
Yes, I have the table of content a little bit further developed. What I was going to propose is I share it, I send it to you all as a shared document, and we can first decide on how the table of content looks. And so I just added a few questions as I heard, as I listened in. And then dus we have the original answers here of Lisa Muller and Umpleby, and I'll paste them in, and then people. Okay, dus this whole thing can be modified as feedback comes in. But I thought it was useful because, like Larry was telling, they call it here data, but probably unit analysis is maybe a more interesting distinction. Is there anyone that wants to say anything right now?
The question on the table is whether anyone's interested in sort of heading this up. And I'd be glad to make a stab at integrating this if Jaime could put this out as a Google document that people could throw things into.
Okay.
So what we're looking at is a structure proposed by Loet of a table of contents, and some of the points need to be brought into this. And and how we start going from the problem of inadequate alternatives in Larry's language, and how do we talk, how do we seek new systems. That in my language is about social change. How do we get the issues of alternatives on the table, and alternatives to science in our paradigms today. So I'd be glad to help work with that and put things together, but people need to throw ideas on like we're doing today, but now we have a structure, thank God. At least a skeleton.
I think we should preferably have someone writing one page or so on such a subject.
Yeah, but Lou, that is impossible because I have noticed we have 6 people that are thinking very uniquely, very strongly, very sophisticated with their own language. So for one person to have the super mind of being all 6 of us at once, that's impossible.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense, I think, that you try to find a way to say what you think for each question in the most effective way, and then every one of us does that, and then
Okay.
we see what our differences are, and then we can start thinking about what we agree on.
That works. I think also before my move, I sent out message about 8 different brains. Perhaps a little bit of input from that 8 different perspectives of 8 different set of opinions would also help here to allow us a more comprehensive framework.
Loet, I would like to apologize for what I said earlier, because your one-page description could be the purpose of the table of contents. So, yes.
I think what is on the table now, the table of contents, which is now on the screen, is quite impressive.
Well, it's
given the chaos of our collation, chaos of our discussion.
It gives us something that we can hammer on as a group. And that then allows us to say, oh, we don't know enough about, let's say, the American Revolution, Christie, say something about it. Or we don't know enough about languages, Loet, you say something about that. And those then presentations would go towards perfecting our outline.
Yeah.
So out of our chaos, we would then have a document that we're then trying to develop jointly, and then each of us in our own expertise can bring up their topic area that may elaborate and get a group think about something.
Agreed.
Right.
Perhaps
Edmondo, any questions? Because you have some interesting perspectives. No.
Who was it directed to?
Your question, Jaime?
I didn't hear what you said. You were asking Edmondo, I think.
Yeah, if he has any other questions on what we're trying to do and how we can perfect our document here.
Yes, I like to hear you give a stop to the problem statement, like Larry did.
It crossed my mind that Edmondo could be the coordinator.
Yeah, I think we need some time to contemplate with this current table of content and maybe add things, maybe different versions, but this is a very good start already.
Yes.
But are you thinking about a book or something like that on these subjects?
Well, the format I see in 1974, Stuart Brand put a book together called Two Cybernetic Frontiers. And he compared the MIT computer labs that started Star Wars in the gaming industry and the personal computer world and all that. So he outlined that as one future. The other future he talked about, which was what we're trying to deal with, was Bateson, communication, culture. How do you get that interaction? And his comment was, as powerful as these technologies will be, when people are able to solve the problems of communication that Bateson and others are talking about, and that strain of cybernetics, it will become much more powerful for the future of humanity. So it'd be like a two frontiers. We're talking about science 1, science 2, the existing paradigm, and the alternatives and methodologies to develop those paradigms. And it would be in a short book, short pamphlet, 35 pages, 60 pages.
I would like to see it eventually evolve into a documentary movie that can be broadcast by PBS.
That would be very doable. I mean, we have people that we could interview about where the limits are, where we are now, where we need to go, because a lot of people don't read anymore.
Yes.
So what will be the topic for next week? Any ideas?
do we want to, Jaime and I could help work together and kind of develop our table of contents, get it out to the group, and then we can go through the table of contents and add people's inputs.
Unfortunately, I don't have this coming week. I don't have this kind of time.
Yeah, I think the table of contents needs more thinking. So maybe we can put it to the one after 28th. On 28th, Loet and me and Jaime, you agree that we're going to talk about that dual phase mechanism framework. So we need something on 21. I mean, that's 28. So we need something for 21, 21st. So who has an idea?
All right.
Larry, would you like to give us a 7-slide introduction of your layman book?
Let's invite someone who hasn't done anything yet.
Yeah, Larry hasn't done anything.
Yeah, we have.
You've done nothing. You've done absolutely nothing, Larry.
To force you to do things in 7 slides.
I was talking about invitations.
Well, maybe the title is sufficient. It's temporary title. It will likely change. A way of thinking about ways of thinking, : a thinker's guide to cybernetics in everyday life.